So this idea or this concept of the wounded healer is a very raw conversation for some of us. And I think some of us are going to perhaps be a little bit triggered, but I'm hoping inspired. And it is, for the most part, it has to take a slight mental approach towards it in the beginning to plug us into the absolute perfection of what is unfolding, of what the wounded healer is, and also how many cultures have actually discussed this. But I want to invite you to not get too lost into the mentality and to the intellectual part of it. And as we slowly bring it more and more emotionally raw and personal at the end. There are many, many areas of life that have spoken about the wounded healer, but funny enough, that is a term that is considered to be very Jungian from psychology. But essentially, it shows up right in shamanism, which, as many people know, is considered the original, could you call it religion, according to anthropology. And what's so fascinating about the story, so I'm going to give you just a few of what you could call birth stories around this wounded healer. The shamanism one is quite fascinating because the idea is in shamanism that if you are being called to become this healer of some sort, I'm just trying to mute one person up here. If you get called to be this healer of sorts, in shamanism, they speak about an illness, and it's called a mystery illness. And this mystery illness can sometimes take an entire person's life before they actually discover what it is that's out playing. And in the myth, which shows up on nearly every continent, including Africa, in the myth, there could be a lot of body sensations, but it tends to be mind, it tends to be emotional, it tends to jump all over the place, and tends to keep doctors and parents and all those in the know-how constantly trying to guess what it is that's actually going on here. And that would be very much the shamanistic side. And what's quite incredible is, I'm trying to think how much detail I should go into that. No, you know what I'll say? I don't know if any of you have ever read parts of the Gospel of St. Thomas, but there's a term there that he speaks about where he says that, I don't know the exact words, but he says that if you do not bring out what is within you will come out and destroy you. And that's very much the shamanistic approach, that this thing that is rising will rise by your hand, by your engagement, or it will rise regardless and destroy you. Now, that's quite a heavy message, right? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the true message. It has been my experience, but that's the shamanistic side. Where things get so beautiful is if we start to dive a little bit into Greek mythology. Now, in Greek mythology, I don't know who knows the story, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I think it is so relevant to start to unlock this archetype. Is Chiron was a centaur, if I'm not mistaken, and just trying to think of what I remember about him. And as the centaur, what was quite fascinating is the centaur generally was considered to be this really primordial animal, of course, but Chiron stood out in his own way because he essentially was a very evolved, apparently, like he held the perfect balance between being highly present and this animalistic thing. And he was also known to be an incredible healer that used all sorts of herbs and plants, and he has an incredible ability to heal. Now, as the story goes, Chiron, while I'm going to be very playful because I'm not a Greek specialist, but while messing around with Hercules with an arrow, they basically dropped the arrow onto his thigh. And what was on, now this is going to be so important to see where we're going to go with this talk. What was actually on this arrow was, for now, we're just going to call it a poison, but a medicine. And these two words are going to be interchanged quite powerfully in this talk. The term is chironic, and basically it means, and we'll unfold it later, even in the Bible, chironic, it would basically be that something is either used as a poison, and it's either used as a medicine, or in the Bible as a scapegoat, and all three. Now, we only see that in the Bible, but in medicine and in mythology, we see that it is this interchangeable thing. So how this gets interesting is that his own medicine that he's mixing essentially penetrates his leg, and he becomes forever ill. And yes, I am shortening the story, but he basically gets a wound that he is forever cursed with. And what's important to remember about Chiron is that Chiron was immortal. So very much like we think of the Bodhisattva or we think of the Christ, we talk about these beings that hold this wound for eternity, for humanity. So he has this absolute psychic and physical pain that will never go away, and is immortal. One can only think about the absolute ramifications of that. And where the story gets so interesting is, and I might, Prometheus, where the story gets so interesting is Prometheus steals fire from the gods. And in stealing fire from the gods, now if you're into astrology, Prometheus is Uranus, is it? Anyway, it brings consciousness to humanity. And Hercules basically, is so angry with Prometheus that they decide to punish him eternally. And basically Prometheus gets put on this rock, and a little bit of his liver is eaten every single day. And Chiron, being this incredible healer that is in such deep suffering and immortal, chooses to take his place. And I'm leaving out big parts of the story, but for us to really get present, the word chironic comes from the fact that, as I said, something can be a medicine and it can be a poison or a scapegoat, according to biblical text. So he replaces Prometheus, and Zeus essentially agrees to this. And what's fascinating is, you to jump in the story, he eventually fades into culture and becomes what you could call a constellation. So to kind of be stuck forever suffering with this archetype that returns into humanity's own astrological sign. And what a fascinating story, because it starts to bring up such incredible questions about, just about what a medicine actually is. And I find that the Greek mythology stories are incredibly insightful about the psyche that actually outplays inside us. It's quite fascinating. Then if we were to move, now to me, these things are all interrelatable. I know it's a little bit of a controversial thing to say, but for instance, if you were to read through a lot of the Bible and Hebrew texts, and you were to perceive certain of the characters as actually being astrological or planets, you would be absolutely stunned how much of the sacred texts are actually talking about the different forces and archaeological expressions that come into our lives. But you don't have to believe that. If we were to just anchor astrology, what's so fascinating to me about astrology, it absolutely blows my mind. I wouldn't say that I'm an avid astrologer either. I can't say I've spent much of my life with it, but I am very, very enamored in Hermetic work, which is some of the ancient body of work that came out of ancient Alexandria. And what's fascinating is, if you look at the origins of, for instance, medicine, and the origins, for instance, of, could you call it chemistry? Chemistry came from alchemy. Alchemy was a spiritual search to understand the substance of something, and chemistry, being a science, was born of that religious pursuit. And if you were to look, for instance, at medicine, it was the same thing. Now, what does this have to do with astrology? Astronomy was born of astrology. It's the most fascinating thing. They were one of the same. You discussed the planets, but you discussed the influence that it had on your crops, on your psyche, on your everything. And it was only later on that astrology was born, just the way that chemistry was born of what did I just call it? Can't think of the word. So that's fascinating. So in astrology, technically, we only found this supposed planet, Chiron, in 1977. And it has a very elliptic, it doesn't have an elliptical axis at all. It has a very, very awkward way and very unpredictable, but of course predictable, being not a planet. Some people, it's classed as an asteroid and a planet simultaneously. Now, what's fascinating about Chiron, if you start getting into this whole thing, is that it's obviously the role of the wounded healer. There's a lot of top astrologies in the world now who are talking about what's called the changing of the gods. And they do mean the god, and they do mean the God as well, the changing of the gods. And one of the changings of the gods that they speak of now is that this return of Chiron in so many people's houses. And Chiron calls for so many things, but we will get there. But essentially what is pretty obvious is that there's a lot of wounding, a lot of trauma, and a lot of responsibility and shadow that comes into the house. The question is, what role does it actually play? So Chiron's a fascinating thing to think about. And what astrology connects us to, and where they've been incredible at unfolding this, but we're going to see psychology has just as much insight into this whole thing. And it actually excites me. When we speak of the wounded healer in astrology, you are not actually just speaking about something bad that happened to you. And I want you to really connect to this. You are talking about a transcendental wound. You are talking about a wound that spans hundreds of lifetimes even. You are talking about a soul aberration that holds incredible gifts, absolute incredible gifts. So you can't say it's something wrong with your soul. And language lets us down here. But we are talking about some sort of thing that needs to be faced, a mountain to be climbed that is omnipresent right across different personalities and bodies. And some of you are aware of the fact that certain challenges in your life are challenges that you were already experiencing when you came in with. Of course, you get your genetic challenges, you get your soul challenges, and we're talking about something that is right at the fabric of this incredible thing that you are, which I would like to not get into too far. And just understanding this, I want you to consider that what's so incredible is that in astrology, they speak about how this great wound, this proverbial desert for yourself. Now, say for yourself, because maybe imagine yours has been thousands of lifetimes of abandonment. Can you imagine? It's so many things that it can be. And what's fascinating is that we have a very short and very impatient version of reality in spirituality nowadays. We've got this idea of like healed or not healed. And that same model gets given to us by the people that are leading us. And it leaves a lot of us really frustrated, really depressed, thinking self-judgment, thinking that this is a process of I've either healed this or I haven't. And I want to completely challenge that in the next few minutes. I am not saying that we should not become complete to a degree with this. I want us to consider that when Chiron comes into the house, not just astrologically, how would you know? Well, if you have been sitting with a wound that even though you are a prolifically profound person, you have read infinite amount of books, you have looked in the darkest of caves, you have traversed the very planet looking for this magnificent seal to this thing that gapes within you. I want you to consider this possibility that there is way more to this. The dangers here, of course, would be the idea that you don't need to heal it. And we will talk later on about how easy it would be to bypass and to transfer and things like that. But I just want you to consider that this person, whatever your thing is, mine has been madness, literally madness and fear, like levels of fear that have pushed me into insanity, psychosis. I've been mentally, I've been institutionalized more than once. And this has been my journey. So I'm going to use madness. And yours could be whatever it be. Could be never feeling safe, never feeling secure. It could be physical illness that keeps visiting you. And I want you to consider that what is being called for, yes, is to heal it, but what is being called for is to learn to have a relationship with that thing. That very thing that can have a poison to one person, as we said, can be a medicine to another. So an example would be me in understanding my fear and knowing that I can become so terrified that I can go into a form of psychosis. I could use that to garner an incredible amount of love and empathy for the human mind, an incredible level of patience for people that have panic disorder and the type of epilepsy I do. There's an example. But at the same time, that very thing, that fear that I deal with, that possibility of psychotically breaking and not being fully present could also cause me to be highly controlling. It could cause me to be very narcissistic and manipulative. And this is quite plainly an example. I mean, if we want a very, very basic example of this is look how, if you were to take a group of alcoholics, look how the one alcoholic can take that very thing, his wound of the substance that follows him and this thing that he has to deal with, and some of them are leaders in AA and have changed hundreds of people's lives. He's still an alcoholic. He's still dealing with the same wound every day of his life, but he's turning it into an elixir of life. Whereas another individual, perhaps he's still at the stage where that thing, just being alcohol, is the poison. And that's where we need to get connected here, where we can try and remove ourselves from this dualistic view or this very polarized idea that things are good or bad. And if we could do that with a thing that you are exhibiting in your own life, wow, a completely different understanding of what it is. So what Chiron leaves us before we move on here, what Chiron leaves us with is this idea that whoever the particular individual is, whatever archetype they've taken of that particular illness, that particular madness, that particular sadness, whatever it is they have to take, that in turning that thing over, or that would be the modern interpretation. Turn it over, you healed, and now you save the world. That is only our interpretation since kind of in the last 60 years. The idea would more be to be present with the wound, to be aware of the fact that you have a deep psyche connection to the specific archetype, and to learn. An example would be someone that has lived in the desert for many years could teach others how to source water and how to find and how to survive and how to eat within that desert. So the paradox is the person will be able to heal, guide, and take so many across that very threshold that quite often they are playfully cursed to hold the bridge of or to remain in the desert of. And that's where, sure, that's where your heart really opens, because either you know someone like that or you have been that person, and it's a huge conversation. The insight and the wisdom that these people, if they engage correctly and courageously, because nature loves courage. I tell you, nature loves courage. The type of stuff that they can squeeze from the stone is an elixir, is manna for others. It's such an incredible thing to consider. So not so much in the abolition of this thing, but more in the relationship with this thing. Because to go to war with the thing would be a denial of the thing, would be a fracturing of the self, would be a polarization of something. So in some ways it is an embracing. If we can think of, there's so many examples about I could use, but if you could think of a loneliness, if you could just think of a person on a deep path of loneliness, the kind of acceptance and love and connection to God that person is able to bring to others. We know this because if we look, for instance, to people like certain of the saints that went into great sanctuary all on their own, the wisdom that can be found. And I suppose you could say that this is where the idea of vices and virtues also play through quite strongly. It's a magnificent thing. And if we look in psychology, it's also such a magnificent conversation. I mean, as you know, Carl Jung came up with the specific term that it's used for nowadays. But I think it's really, really worth noting just a little bit about Carl Jung. Now, I personally am not, once again, deeply studied in this. But what I find quite fascinating is that Carl Jung practically did not write, according to most people that have studied him for their whole lives. He never wrote about anything he wasn't actually experiencing. And he had quite a fascinating life. What I find so interesting is if we were to cut out quite a lot of his life, because he did start off in essentially, even though he was in a Christian home, there were many theologians, I think 5 theologians in his actual family. And it was pretty soon on that, I think after the age of 10, that he began to have really fantastical dreams. And I don't just mean dreams like when you're sleeping, I mean visions and dreams and possibilities. And he was quite a profound scholar. He was a very impressive academic. But where things got really, really interesting was when he decided at a certain point that he was going to commit his time, his vision, his passion to psychiatry. Now, that wouldn't be such a strange thing nowadays, okay? But if you could contextualize this era of the early 1900s, psychiatry was considered a non-science. It was a joke. It was a joke at best. It was a joke. And what's so fascinating is that, of course, he had a very, very rich psychic and dream life, which we won't get into too much. But as most of you who have done any psychology know, he created this profound relationship with this person that we know of as Freud. And for about 9 years, they had a very, very close relationship. I might be wrong, but I think, I'm really pulling stuff out of the air here. I think Freud was 19 years his senior. Actually, I'm positive Freud was 19 years his senior. So in many ways, he was a mentor to Jung. And for 9 years, they had this incredible relationship, which started off as correspondence. And then eventually, when they actually got together and started spending time together, it was said that they would speak 13, 14, 15 hours a day without leaving their chambers. So where things get interesting and why this is very relevant to what we're going to talk about today is I need you to just understand what Carl Jung actually did for the feminine psyche. Now, that's a very strange comment. But basically what happened is Carl Jung started to have all of these ideas. And these ideas, and I'm being very vague, you can go and study this as deeply as you want. We don't have 2.5 hours here to crash course all of these things. I just want to give you an overview here on how dynamic this could be in your life, understanding this archetype. What happens now is his ideas are not fitting in with Freud at all. And he's essentially trying to push that there is much more of a ceiling to what Freud is suggesting. And many people know playfully, it's such a simplistic, it's not true, but partly that, you know, Freud blamed everything on the mother and sexuality and, you know, all sorts of things. But essentially, I believe that Jung outgrew him, and their parting was not a happy parting. Where things get so interesting now with Jung is that he has many experiences. I want to just mention a few of them. In 1913 on a train, I think it was April 1913, I think, he was on a train and essentially in Europe, and he had this incredible dream or vision that was absolutely horrific. It was of pouring rivers of blood and thousands of people dying. Essentially, he foresaw the war. And this experience had an absolutely prolific effect on him. There were many things like this that happened. Like a story that always sticks into my mind was he had a patient who used to mutter 5 sentences about the swirling disk and the sun. I'm not exactly sure what the patient said. This was many years ago that I studied this. And this perplexed him so. And this patient just obsessively used to say this all the time. And about 9 or 10 years after he worked with this patient, the very famous scrolls. I think they were called the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think it was specifically those, because a lot of them were unearthed in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So I could have that wrong. And one of the most fascinating things was that these things had been obviously lost to humanity for a very long time. And essentially one of the translations of the opening scroll were the 5 sentences that this guy had muttered over and over and over. Now, this had such a profound effect on him. And I'm not doing this chronologically. I'm just trying to plug you into who this dude was. So this guy decided, and that's where he birthed the idea of the collective unconscious, because he believed, and he believed he had hundreds of proofs after that, but that was the first one that really smacked him. The fact that he believed that these people were tapping into some form of a thing that we all held collectively. Now, what makes the story so fascinating is that he went on this incredible journey to try and discover, but what we notice already in the man is that there was a lot of room for the mystical. In actual fact, I think in when he was 39, a lot of people actually accused him of being more of a mystic than a doctor. And I think such a good thing. I mean, we can all be very grateful that someone took that leap, because he kept walking into this woo-woo world of dreams and archetypes, and thank goodness he did. So where things get so interesting is that if you jump right to the end now, I mean, you jump right to the end. He believed that there was such interesting stages to kind of a human progressing. And one of the first ones was your apprenticeship, which he called apprenticeship playfully in the Red Book. I think it's called the Red Book if you want to read about it. And what he essentially speaks about there is that in your apprenticeship, you have to meet the shadow. And of course, the shadow has become a really big talking point in spirituality nowadays. And I believe that for a reason, because the gods are changing, the changing of the god. We are aligned under new planets, and what is needed to be done is essentially collective trauma work, processing, ancestral trauma work, stuff like that. And this started to unfold where we began to get terms for this around then. And what's so interesting, what blows my mind about his idea of meeting your shadow, was that he didn't feel that you just had this unconscious darkness to you that you projected onto other people. He also felt, and like most modern shadow work coaches like myself also feel the same way, that there are also aspects of yourself that are heroic, divine gifts that are bubbling within you, that you also project onto people. So not all projection being bad. And an example would be being so moved by a speaker or a healer or the way someone lives their lives. It's that they can hold that tangible archetype of that thing that you wish to birth in you. The same way that in sacred reverence, that the nun or the child could be thinking of the Christed one, or the same one that the Buddha uses the idea of this culmination of this aspect. So what a magnificent thing that basically we project these beautiful qualities onto other people as well as our own shadow selves. Now, to me, what gets so fascinating, which I say often because all of this fascinates me, is that the next stage after your apprenticeship, which I feel is where most of us are in our lives, is trying to reconcile our shadow and allow these wounds to heal, is he would speak about then going within and marrying the masculine and the feminine attributes. I mean, for someone at the turn of the century to even understand that this needed to be done, you can understand why he was considered a mystic. But now with things are so fascinating, is I might have them backwards, but the man had to meet the anime, and the woman had to meet the anima. I'm not sure exactly what the terms were. They were slightly different in syllable. And essentially, the female, and I also, as I said, could have this wrong, she would have to balance the masculine within her, which would bring in an enormous amount of certain things into her life, but very practical. What was more interesting was what the male had to do in bringing in that feminine is essentially, he spoke of it was giving birth to eternity, giving birth to infinity. Basically, he spoke about the masculine energy almost being like the container. In other words, these are the ramifications, or let's build here, or let's create here, or very playful, if you can imagine, we put down this beautiful garden together and we made a wooden box around the outside of it. And we said, okay, let's grow something here. That to him was the masculine. But then the feminine had no holds. There was nothing holding it back. It could create in ways that what you would end up with in that box would be something that would astound you. In other words, it was the God creating force of creativity that could, within any environment. And the reason why it was so important to him is he felt like a man himself, as in being the masculine, who, as we know, was coming from an era of thousands of years of the suppression of the divine. Is he was essentially saying that man, as in a male, female, was always going to be in mystery to the divine until this merge took place. And that's, well, it's just absolutely magnificent to me. I'm not going to go further into his processes, but what was quite fascinating is he made certain sentences. In one of the journals that he wrote, his opening sentence was, "My personal shadow is so enormous that I cannot ignore it or put it as part of my study." So we're talking about someone, and this statement's going to become very important of what I'm going to challenge us in this room. I want to just say this again. This was one of the greatest healers of all time. And the opening lines of one of his books is, "My shadow is so enormous that I cannot push it aside or not make it part of my study." So this is a guy that was right in the thick of things. This is a guy that was owning it. He was like, also, side note, Carl Jung also had an incredible, I love how I just go on tangents. Carl Jung also had an incredible problem with the feminine. He had to heal a big, big wound. And that's why I feel like he was one of the first in modern popular culture, okay? Because essentially he felt very abandoned by his mother. And then he had very difficult relationships. And it was quite a journey for him to actually heal the feminine within himself. And somehow in divine timing, in healing the feminine aspects within himself and beginning to see what the divine feminine actually was, a lot of people say that he essentially brought the feminine into psychology, because up until then we were talking about some really rigid shit, you know, and into psychiatry. And some other statements he made, I'll leave you with one more, is that there is nothing but the infinite. And what was so interesting about his work was he was not, like, for instance, he didn't use terms like "you would become perfected." To him, that was extremely masculine. This idea that as a wounded healer, you could become perfect. He was like such a masculine concept. He would say things like you would become wholesome, or you would become universal. And what he meant by those things is that essentially you would allow all archetypes of all of creation to flow through you peacefully. Now, that's a very different model to what we've spoken about, because that would give us the ability to accept the fact that our emotions fluctuate, that like great oceans, we have in-breaths and out-breaths of depressions and being connected and not being connected, and having the savage wild flow through us at separate times, and feeling anger and feeling absolute gentle love. And I just loved that. He didn't want perfection. He spoke about that it was an impossibility. It was a masculine idea. He wanted wholeness. The many words he used and coined regarding emotions, the word universal. And it makes so much sense to me, because no matter how much I try and use a book, what flows through me is universal, and I can only get more and more present with it. I cannot take it away, nor do I want to, but I can decide whether the elixirs that flow through me are going to be chironic poisons or chironic medicines, or, as the great book told us, the chironic scapegoat. It's a profound thing to think about. So And the idea in this would be, even in shamanism, would be by the age of 35, Jung speaks about that if a person is ill after 35, that it's nearly always spiritual suppression. Which brings us to such an incredible idea. I don't know if you guys are very present with Joseph Campbell. What a magnificent man. And Joseph Campbell essentially realized that it doesn't actually matter what story or what kind of part of reality you try to access truth from, that if you really were sincere, that truth could be accessed from anywhere. What I mean by that is, if you listen to we've just come from Easter. If you listen to the great death and rebirth stories that exist within Christianity and Gnosticism, that exists right through. It existed in Egyptian culture. It exists, and the idea is that Joseph Campbell spoke, and it's called, one of the most incredible books, called The Hero of a Thousand Faces. It's one of the first books on my bookshelf. But he spoke about basically, and it's a term that he's coined, but that is completely accepted. And this is the idea that our archetypes, or our psychology, or our psyche has certain myriad things to it. And no matter what you do, an example is, there's a tribe near India that some of you have read about that haven't been interfered with for thousands of years. In actual fact, it's illegal to go there. And if you listen to their stories, what's quite fascinating to notice is that the same sort of stories show up. So to be really simplistic, if we talk about what the great hero's journey is, it's this idea that first there's the calling. You'll see this in the Bible, you see this in Hebrew text, you'll see this and there's this calling. And then you ignore the call. Doesn't mean you have to go through every step, but I've actually got this mapped out on a poster. It's magnificent. And then there's this calling, and you tend to ignore the calling. And very often the calling makes you sick, makes you ill. We can think of moments in the Bible where God actually called out. And then the idea would be, if we can skip some stages, that eventually you have to decide to go into the darkness and meet this wound, this demon, this terrifying idea. And in that darkness, you would have to get all the skills of that thing to be able to emerge. In other words, if your enemy was cunning, you would have to become cunning yourself. And basically, in the slaying of this dragon, that you would eventually emerge. And emerging from there, you would emerge with these magnificent gifts. And these gifts would be jewels for all of humanity. And I think it's important for us to pause here for a second, because we're not going to be much longer. I want us to pause here and just consider that there has always been a human story unfolding. Let's call it the collective story. So the rise and fall of civilizations, the rise and fall of religions, the golden age, the dark age, and I want us to consider that that's the collective story. And that collective story, then there's also your individual story. So there's the collective psyche, and then there's your psyche. And very often that collective story of the rise and fall, the breaking and the building, is perfectly placed to create pressure within our individual stories to get us to emerge in the ways that needed. So if you're not sure what I've just said, an example would be that the Dark Ages led to a great renaissance. Why? Because if you suppress and you push hard enough on the human spirit, we've even seen this during these COVID times, whatever your opinion of it is, you've noticed that if you push too hard on the human spirit, that some sort of rebellion takes place. And for those that fear what will happen with humanity, I fear that they're sometimes a little bit too connected to how perfect the story actually is. In other words, yes, there are beginnings and there are endings, sometimes of entire civilizations and ways of being. But your personal story unfolds so perfectly within that. It's so magnificent to connect to. It's why I've always playfully said that you should be very cautious if you decide to investigate chaos. I think one of the greatest diseases of modern kind is that we investigate chaos to a degree where we do not have calm inner waters. And what I mean by that is, if you were to go onto the internet and discover every negative agenda that's happening in the world, you could cause a psychotic break within yourself. You could become poison to everybody around you. You could infuse people with your fear. And if you do not understand the relationship that chaos and perfection hold, and if you're confused, think about the ocean. Right now, there are many places where that perfectly balanced being of the ocean is raging and tearing entire coastlines and buildings down. The ocean is not out of balance. That's just what it's expressing there at that time. And it's exactly the same. I want you to consider that if you're standing on a street corner and you see a group of people having an argument and a car crash and all of this thing, you are just observing the chaos. And the chaos is always framed by perfection, and then is framed by chaos, and then is framed by perfection. Planets collide and explode, and entire stars end. But if you pull back and you actually look at the galaxy, you understand that all is in perfect order. So if you do decide in your own path to investigate very deeply in what you could call chaos, you need to make sure that you have your other hand holding God's, because you can lose yourself. You really can. Do you not think that there have been agendas of nefarious needs since the beginning of time? Do you not think that heroes and dark beings have risen and fallen millions of times? So what is this going to, this whole wounded healer thing that we've painted here, what is that going to leave us with in a modern time? Of course, I mean, there's always the danger of bypassing, because essentially we're talking about a psychic gift, a psychic illness, a mental illness, a physical illness that you would know if you had, because you're at your wit's end. You have tried to get rid of this thing so much and so long that it seems to permeate your essence. It very often permeates your entire family line. And of course, bypassing would be a very strong possibility of modern kind. So it would be very easy for us to become aware of this wound and aware of what a deep understanding we get surrounding this wound. And it would be quite easy to try and uplift ourselves egoically by running around and trying to fix people with a similar problem. But I do feel that a really serious amount of balance can be found within it. And you can turn that very thing, whether it's loneliness or addiction or disease, you can turn it into something that is a profound medicine for others. If we could use a simple example, let's try and use a simple example. Some of you have heard me speak about empaths, right? So the result of the chironic age, or the result of the wounded healer, being the archetype that essentially is dominating in our consciousness. The result of that, of course, is that many, many empaths are born. That is a gift that is born of the collective trauma. Now, if you look, this is going to be the perfect example of how something can be chironic. As I said, when I say chironic, it means it is neither charged in either direction until it is hit by the person and their relationship with that thing. So an empath could be an incredible gift to humankind, but we also know, for instance, that it's very hard to be an empath. So an example is they usually are born in trauma. They learn to experience all sorts of amazing gifts, like they can tell changes in facial expressions. They can listen to breathing better than other people. And it's usually a trauma response. And they can tell if your tone of voice changes. And you guys get the point. I'm not going to go too deeply into it. And now we can see how an empath can be somebody that can bring profound insight into somebody's life later on. We can also see how that kind of wound can turn someone into what they call the dark empath. And the dark empath is the person that over-dominates their environment, that blames everybody else, that blames negative, is terrified of negative energy, doesn't want certain people in their spaces, tends to cut off people, block them instantly. And this is just the archetype of the two possibilities, where the other person becomes so aware of empathy, how sensitive they are to energies, how deep the love can be, embraces other people. Perfect example, being an empath is chironic. It is not good, it is not bad. You could go as far as to do this with alcohol, cocaine, absolutely anything, and it'll trigger you so bad if you get someone to really do this process. The thing merely exists. That's all that it is. The charge comes when we arrive, our relationship with that thing. So what this says for us in our lives is we have perfect examples there that you're the only person who's going to be able to decide just how honest you are regarding this particular thing. For an example, if you were sexually abused and you help liberate people, are you passing your anger on? Are you passing your wound on? Or are you passing on the part of you that is able to understand, to complete that thing? If you're a drug addict, I mean, it's a known fact that people will say, for instance, if you were once a drug addict, you will be I love this example, you will be an excellent counselor to do with drugs, but the monkey on your back will be that for all of your life, you might have what they call overexposure. And overexposure means you talk about drugs so often that you relapse. And that's a very simple example of how you almost vulnerably have to learn to stand in this wound. And it is a lifetime escapade generally. So if it's madness, I would say that in fairness, I feel there's a little part of me that's always convinced that, that being mentally stable is not always a given. I feel almost like a little bit of a vulnerability that it could be taken away from me at any moment. And I felt like that my entire life. And if I rage against the fact that I know that there is a part of me that's mentally unstable, I go fucking insane. I go insane. And the more I try and fix the fact that I have a psychological problem, so now I'm personalizing it, the more I absolutely unwind, I doubt everything, I rage against my own nature, I become terrified to how deep the rabbit hole might go. And I've been that person. I also know the person that has accepted the fact that after 20 years of raging against this, what appeared to be a wound within me, I now know that this person still has a very hard time at times, but this person does talks about it, and this person helps people with their own shadow and their own, and that's a perfect example of, in some ways, my own chironic essence, my own elixir is at work. And if it sounds cruel, I don't think it really is, because, you know, a lot of you are very well versed in spiritual knowledge and practices, and it is one of the most recorded things in history, the innate beauty and the expansion that comes from suffering. I personally do not think that the idea is to be happy. I think the idea is to be meaningful. And within the context of being meaningful, you cannot believe what you can endure. And the real joke is, if you don't want to take this philosophy on, you might still continue to suffer every day. Perhaps you are not, and you are observing this from far, and that's okay. But it's an extreme thing. An example of this, like as one of my closing statements, would be, if you have something that you suffer with greatly, has it ever occurred to you that a lot of your suffering is the way you feel about what you feel? I would put 75% of psychic, mental, and emotional pain in that category. The way I feel about the way I feel. So an example is, if you're a very, very anxious person, you've been anxious your whole life, and if you are willing to embrace, and you know what, the chances are there are so much collective trauma for us to work through, that the chances are that you don't just have one fucking problem unfolding. So let's just put anxiety as one of your many problems. But let's say that you're an anxious person and you've been anxious your whole life, but you've never been given the wounded healer archetype. You don't understand the power of Chiron, the healer. You don't understand what Earth has called us to do. You have got lost in this modern spirituality that makes us really like ostracize ourselves as single entities looking for enlightenment, not part of a hive mind, which I find quite ridiculous, but that's just me. Then if that's the case, now look at your anxiety and go, okay, well, there's something wrong with me. And everybody else tells you you shouldn't feel anxious. And everybody else tells you, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And you go on this obsessive journey to try and solve your anxiety. Now, granted, a lot of your anxiety might be solved, but what you tend to find with those that have really suffered is they'll tell you that what I found was acceptance. What I found was ways to dance with the thing. So in other words, when fear puts its hand out, you're anxious in your anxiety. What do? Do you turn that into a destructive habit? Do you go and hurt someone? Do you scream at someone? But essentially, that anxiety unfolds. And for the rest of your life, it's with you to decide what you're going to do with it, as I said, as a chironic aspect. And that's quite something to realize, because if you had less opinions about what was wrong with you, would you be more at peace? If right now you believed me just for 2 minutes that what I'm saying could be true, would you not find a deep sense of peace to not fucking go to bed tonight and actually go, geez, there's something so wrong with me. I can't believe I'm this age and I haven't hacked it yet. Man, what am I going to find? When am I going to sort this out? So the path of the wounded healer is a complicated one, because whereas many, many problems can be solved and healed, as we well know, we're talking about an archetype that spans thousands of years and is an ultimate gift and a curse at the same time, and only you can decide if you're part of something like that. Of course, transfiguration and transmutation is not the word. Transfiguration is possible. It's always possible. It's a magnificent thing to consider. It's a magnificent thing to consider. And in your own journey, only you can decide exactly where you are with the process. I think my last statement that I'd like to make is that I really feel we need to get rid of titles. This idea of being overly enlightened is destroying us. We've got this idea of a group of people that have got it figured out, even though they're just as fucked up as the rest of us. What's required is for us to hold hands, is to sit in circles and transmute pain together. What's required is for us to humble ourselves and to open the access of other people to heal by going, I also have that. By going, I am scared too. By going, I also cannot feel God some nights. This idea of putting a bunch of us on a pedestal who only have that pedestal because they have that wound. This is the joke. They are that clever because they have that ancestral wound. So if they could come sit down in a circle with you and actually go, yeah, put your hand here and let me show you that I'm hurting in that same way right now, we would learn to trust each other. We would stop having this fucking hierarchy in spirituality. We would get rid of this, you know, I mean, I don't even want to use all the terms. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about. We don't need people to pretend to have it done. We need to be around people that are admitting the pain so we can collectively transform it. Hold each other, hold each other's hands, cry together, sing together, collect together, and have healers that are right in it, right in it, right in it. And you will know if you're feeling the need to raise yourself above it all, then you're bypassing. You can lead and you can do something magnificent with your life by walking into shame. And I don't know if enlightenment exists, but I do know that if it does, it is not towards the light, it is directly into my shame.